Are you confused by how notes, scales, and chords work and you don't read music or you just play by ear? Well, here's music theory explained in under 6 minutes. First off, it's important to know there are only 12 notes like in existence. Once we hit 12, they start to repeat. Like on a piano, it repeats to a higher or a lower octave until we just can't hear it any longer. For some reason, we label them as A through G in the alphabet, but that's only 7 letters, and that means that each one has a note between, except for E and F and B and C. So between the letter names, you can refer to it as flat or sharp, so there are essentially 2 different names for one note. For example, the note between D and E can either be called D sharp or E flat. Kind of like how if it was 3:30 o'clock, you could say the time is either 3:30 or 30 till 4. Both mean the same thing. So one more thing before we move on to keys and scales, I want to mention that the distance between each note is either a whole step or a half step. A half step is when you go from one note directly to the next one. A whole step is when you go from one note and you skip over a note. Okay, so since I said there are 12 notes, how do we know which ones to use when we're writing a song? Do we use all 12 or do we have certain ones at our disposal? As it turns out, if we just pick a scale or a key, that will determine 7 of the 12 that we should use. So how do we do that? Well, I invented a key/scale picking device that will tell us which notes we can use for our song. So if I place it starting on C, my device shows 7 notes that I can use. But why 7, and how did it determine which ones to use? Well, it picked what is known as a major scale. Scales are this naturally occurring pattern that determines which notes you can use in a song. Every scale has a formula based on the spacing of notes. All major scales start on any note, and then from here go whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, which is what my key scale picker device is set to. It covers up the notes that are outside of the C major scale and only includes the 7 that are in it. So once again, you can slide through the whole continuum of notes and my device will show you the 7 notes in each key or scale based on the whole, half, whole, half pattern. Since there's only 12 notes that we can start on, that means there's only 12 major scales and there's only 12 keys like in existence. Okay, so what's the point of that? Well, the point is that there are only 12 keys to choose from when writing a song. Every song you've heard on the radio is just one of 12 keys usually. So here's an analogy. The difference between a scale and a key can be illustrated with playing cards. So pretend that my ace is the 1, or the root, since I don't have a 1 as a card, and these 7 cards are the notes in my scale. So a 7 card straight would be the scale, and then the suit, which would be spades, would be like the key in general. So a straight is just a way of organizing the cards in an ascending sequence, kind of like how a scale is. It's just a way of organizing them in a row. In short, once you pick a key, you have essentially eliminated 5 bad sounding notes, and you've picked 7 good sounding notes for your song. So now these 7 notes will decide our chords. It's cool because our key choice decided our notes, and now our notes are going to decide our chords. If you take basically any song you hear on the radio, let's just pretend the song is an A. That means like every note played on bass or piano or sung is one of these 7 notes. Now before we move on, I'm going to circle these notes, square these notes, and put a triangle over this one, and I'll explain that in a second. So chords are usually 3 or 4 notes played at the same time, and it's usually like every other note of a scale that are played together, not usually ones right next to each other. So for example, if we're in C, we can use my handy key scale picker device and it shows these 7 notes. If we select every other note starting with C, this is called a C major chord. Now if we shift it up and start on D and select every other note, we will end with a D minor. So this raises the question, why was the C a major and why was the D a minor? Well, the answer has to do with the spacing of each note in the chord itself. And it can be illustrated by why I drew a circle, a square, or a triangle around certain spots. The cool thing about this is that for every key across the board, the chords will either be major, which are happy, the circled ones, or minor, sad sounding, which are the square ones in the same locations. Okay, so here's how it works. First, let's number the scale degrees. So C is 1, D2, E3, F4, G5, A6, and B7. Since the next note is C again, we don't need to continue as it will just repeat. All right, so this is how many musicians think of music in terms of numbers because the numbers don't change even when the letters do. So earlier when we took C, which is 1, and picked 2 additional notes above it, and in every other kind of fashion, we end up with C major, which is called the 1 chord since C is the 1. So then D minor, we outlined, will be the 2 chord, and you just continue that pattern. So if we kept going, E would be E minor, which would be the 3 chord, and so on. So now here's the one thing that you have to memorize in order for this to all make sense. When we're in major, the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord will always be major. though they will be major because the pitch is naturally spaced out that way. On the other hand, the 2, 3, and 6 chords will always be minor by default, and that's just the way it is. So just memorize those. You don't necessarily have to understand why, but if you just know that as a fact, it will help you in the long run. Alright, so here's a real world example of my lesson. This song is in G, so we can go through and say which chords there are and which 3 notes are in each chord. The first is E minor, the little M means minor, so if we go to E on our scale, it's our 6, and if we play every other note starting on E, we get E, G, and B. So E minor, our 6th chord, contains the notes E, G, and B. Next is D, which is our 5 chord, and every other note starting with D is D, F sharp, A. Next is G major, our 1 chord containing G, B, D. Next is C, our 4 chord, which contains the notes C, E, G, and so on. So in a nutshell, music is just a game of playing 3 every other notes for your chord, and then choosing notes in common with each chord change for your melody. Thanks for watching.